Hello and welcome to Islam Bergerak TV. As we are all aware of the shocking live documentation of the genocide in Gaza, we cannot help but ask some critical and even existential questions on our current state of humanity. Yet amidst the seemingly endless violence and vulgar atrocities and the hegemony of the powerful global politicians and media outlets against the Palestinian struggle for liberation, we also witness the solidarity for Palestine screams across the world from different spectrums of political and religious affiliations and different age range. We witness people of older generations of Jewish Holocaust survivors up to the youth and teenagers who utilizes social media and TikTok, for example, to express their support for Palestine. And today we have a special guest, Sister Aisha Hasan from the UK, who will discuss with us the subsequent impact of the Hamas attack on October 7th last year, to share her analysis and insights and what does it mean for the mainstream feminist movements and mainstream social movement in general, who seems to have a different kind of reactions towards it. And so we are very happy to have Sister Aisha. Sister Aisha Hasan is part of the Ummatics Institute, a research organization for the study of Ummatics thoughts and practice, and a producer at TRT World. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Qarawiyyin Project, an initiative dedicated to engaging Muslim women in Islamic discourse. Welcome, Sister Aisha.
Thank you so much, Sister Rizki. It's really great to be here. Alhamdulillah. I'm looking forward to the conversation today, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for your time. Sister Aisha, can you explain about what do you think about the current geopolitical conditions and dynamics since the October 7th last year? Do you think any significant changes in the global geopolitical situation today? And why do the Arab countries around Palestine seems unable to, do significant help for the struggle for the Palestinian people?
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. SubhanAllah, I mean, we are on day 181 now of Israel's war on Gaza. And unfortunately, we're just seeing the situation go from bad to worse. Over the past week, we've seen the end of Israel's operation at a Shifa hospital. And the pictures that are coming out of this alleged operation have been absolutely devastating. I mean, aid workers and researchers are saying they've never seen anything like it in history. And it's kind of ironic to think about now, given how 5 months ago, after Israel, bombed the Al-Ahli hospital, they proclaimed that they would never bomb a hospital, they would never attack a hospital. And yet now 5 months down the line, it's become so completely normalized that the brutality of which we are seeing here is completely unspeakable. It's not just a bombing campaign. This has been point blank execution of doctors, nurses, patients, children. We're seeing pictures of bodies being squashed under tanks, decomposing babies and patients in the hospital beds. We're reading the messages the doctors and patients that were trapped there for the last 2 weeks in the hospital wrote on the walls to the rest of the world, knowing that this would be their last words. And yet, despite the severity and the unparalleled brutality of Israel's crimes, we haven't actually seen any major changes in the geopolitical sphere beyond the outrage at Israel. Having said that, I think over the next couple of days, we will perhaps see more developments on that side. Since at the time of recording this week, Israel targeted and killed 7 aid workers who were working with an international aid organization providing food to people in Gaza. And those aid workers had British passports, American passports, European passports. And unfortunately, this is what it seems to have taken to provoke some kind of real response against Israel. So we might see some of those developments changing in the next couple of days. But really, despite everything that has happened over the past 6 months, we've seen nothing in terms of political action against Israel. The UN Security Council resolution from last week has yet to see any real enforcement or implementation, with almost a kind of unspoken assumption that the US would go and speak to Israel now that this has been passed by the Security Council. Unfortunately, although Biden now is speaking to Netanyahu regarding these aid workers who were killed, there still isn't a unilateral demand on the part of the US that Israel needs to stop its bombing campaign and needs to end the occupation. But most poignantly, I think, aside from even Western states' support for Israel and how that's translating in the geopolitical sphere, unfortunately, we see that neighboring Arab and Middle Eastern countries have changed very, very little in their stance towards Israel in recent months, other than a lot of rhetoric about how Israel needs to stop doing this to the Palestinians and Israel is committing a genocide. You know, trade is still flowing through all the surrounding states to Israel. The most that a country like Turkey has done has been to delist Israel as a favored export destination on their website, which doesn't really change much in terms of the actual goods that are being sent there. I've been seeing recently some promotional videos of King Abdullah of Jordan training for a military operation as if his palace was to be attacked, and other videos of him, you know, dropping aid from planes over Gaza. And it's honestly an insult to our intelligence and our dignity as Muslims that we would ever really think this kind of action is sufficient. This is a disgrace that it's been 6 months. Israel is committing a genocide on 2 million people trapped in a very, very small area of land. And out of their own self-interest and fear of repercussions, no neighboring country that expresses support for the Palestinians has actually been able to take a stronger stance against Israel because of what they fear it would provoke.
So we have this strong protests across the world, and at the same time we have the political leaders who can actually do something to stop the genocide, but remains being hypocritical, even the so-called Muslim majority countries surrounding the Palestine. And in terms of the wave of protests and all the actions of solidarity for Palestine, including the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, sanction movement to stop aiding Israel, and the Yemeni Houthis who tried to successfully, I think, blockade the Red Sea and kind of disrupt the flow of the trade, and also attack against the Israeli military and economic sector. What do you think? How have these forms of resistance contributed to the escalation or the de-escalation of the situation in Palestine and perhaps global geopolitics in general?
Yeah. It's great you mentioned Yemen there, actually. I think that has been obviously the one exception that we've seen from the poorest country in the region that has been suffering a humanitarian crisis themselves. But by virtue of, you know, the Yemeni government, which has obviously, you know, come out of the revolution and the civil war that the country has been experiencing for several years, the Yemeni authorities going and blockading the Red Sea in that way has been the only kind of action that a state has taken in, you know, in action as well as word. And yet, because obviously Yemen is a country that is otherwise perhaps probably the most disempowered in the region, unfortunately, that has not had the kind of repercussions we would have hoped. But as a gesture not only of solidarity, but of materially making a difference to global trade flows, that was a very, very significant step that, you know, definitely contributed to escalating the situation and putting it on, because now it was threatening other European interests. It was threatening worldwide trade flows between Europe and Asia. And, you know, this was something that really, unfortunately, until you target the economic interests of some of these global players, you won't see you won't see those governments trying to make a move. Because as you've said, we've seen, you know, protests since the start of this attack over the past 6 months. And really, I think the amount of support that we have seen has been unprecedented. the Palestinian cause has been fairly mainstream, I think, as foreign conflicts go. This is not always something that you can expect the average person to be particularly aware of, disputes in other countries. But this is something, but the Palestinian cause always enjoyed a little bit more fame in that respect, and was a little bit more acceptable. But what we've seen more recently is unlike anything we've seen before. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people going out every weekend in almost every single major world city, and calling for not just a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire for this war, but an end to the occupation more generally. And I think that when you say, how has this contributed to sort of the escalation or de-escalation of situation in Palestine, one, the positive thing, if you can call it that has come out of this war is that the Palestinian issue itself is back on the international agenda. We have to remember that, before this war started, Israel was very confident that the Palestinian issue was dead. Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, were keen to normalize relations, and there were numerous under-the-table meetings that were in progress to facilitate that. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had stood up in the UN and shown a map of Israel on the Middle East, and Palestine wasn't even included on that map, and that was allowed to happen without any significant outcry. We are in a very different situation today, where there is so much more awareness of Israel's crimes, and these calls for the end of the occupation are occurring, every single week around the world. And Israel has even been taken to the International Court of Justice for genocide. Unfortunately, we're obviously still awaiting the outcome of that, and many people are still using the interim ruling that there is plausible case for genocide as an excuse to not take any action on that front. But it is significant in that this was not a situation that we could have envisaged 7 months ago. It's also become a very defining issue domestically for many countries in the West. Society has become polarized almost overnight. And with elections coming up, definitely in the US and in the UK, this has become a major issue, particularly for minority and Muslim communities. It's something that the Democrat campaign in the US is very concerned about. They're trying to re-elect Joe Biden, and, coming out of his term, what are people going to remember about him except the fact that he's known as now Genocide Joe? It's incredibly embarrassing. And similarly in the UK, the Labour Party is battling with the fact that they have lost the Muslim vote by refusing to call for a ceasefire earlier on, and being very similar to the Conservative Party that is currently in power in the UK in terms of the rhetoric that they've been using to talk about the Israel-Palestine situation. So the repercussions of this, I think, are also going to be seen in a very in the long term. Israel's reputation, I think, has been destroyed. Definitely, I think while many people felt sympathy, of course, after the October 7th attacks, many states and many Westerners felt that Israel has been the victim of a terror attack. That has been almost completely eliminated because of the way in which they've gone on to slaughter tens of thousands of people, and the kind of genocidal rhetoric that I think everybody is quite shocked at, that comes not just from Israeli politicians, but also from within Israeli society. And I think that's raising a lot of questions as to how society could have reached such extreme levels where that kind of talk has become normalized. So I think in the future, the way in which Israel conducts itself with the broader international community will end up being very different.
I think that kind of there's a spark of optimism from our response, and it is indeed, I mean, there's like a hope, a shining light at the end of the tunnel, especially when you mentioned about the decrease of the Muslim voters in the UK and in the US regarding how with the Genocide Joe, and with the fact that Labour Party somehow have a really ambiguous, or if not pro-Israeli stance. And we witness also like people like Candace Owens finally, decided to be more critical, and she got fired from the Daily Wire. And we have even Piers Morgan invited people who be able and well articulate in explaining their pro-Palestine stance. We have Norman Finkelstein, Ilan Pop, Miko Pellet speak about the genocide in Gaza. While the fact that they have a Zionist, or they have a very strong Jewish roots. So I think just to relate to what you mentioned earlier about how this changed actually the international outlook towards the Israel. But then on the other hand, it seems that Israel is still increasingly showing its non-compliance with the international law and violating the limits of crimes against Palestinians. And I mean, to some people, they become kind of a bit hopeless and pessimistic about, so what's the point of all this massive protests and mass action that the people have organized? Does it have any impact in terms of the international law, in terms of the sanction against the Israel?
I think it's unfortunate because Israel is continuing to behave in this way. And, as you're saying, people are like, well, what's the point of the protests and the mass discontent? Because it doesn't seem to have any impact on Israel. And I think if anything has come out of this war, it is the sheer incompetence of the international system that has actually been used selectively and repeatedly to advance Western interests, as is clear in the case of Russia's war against Ukraine, where we're seeing very similar. Obviously, actually, we're seeing worse right now because this is a case of genocide. And in this case, international law was frequently invoked to highlight Russia's war crimes, but Israel has been completely immune to any kind of international action that the US was leading from within international organizations. And this was most obvious for me, I think, when last week, when the UN Security Council was finally able to pass that ceasefire resolution, after 6 months of putting that forward and having it repeatedly vetoed by numerous states, and then finally the US was the only one, and then obviously they abstained. But the member state envoys, after that resolution was passed, actually broke out into applause. And that's extremely rare to see during a resolution vote. And I think it reflected the frustration that countries in the global South have felt, that purely because of Western and primarily American backing, no one has been able to condemn Israel strongly enough. And this is something that I think the world and the international system will pay for in years to come, that if you have one member who's going around and breaking the rules without any significant repercussions, why are those rules going to be respected? The system that has been put in place since World War II is at a very dangerous cliff edge, that if the entire system can be held hostage to one country, in this case, the United States, refusing to enact the measures that should be enacted when a country is in such clear violation of international law that Israel is, then that's a real severe indictment on the suitability of that system to actually organize everybody else's engagement in international relations. It's one that I think, unfortunately, many countries will suffer for if those rules, are suddenly disregarded by other states. But it's also exposed how inept some of these organizations have been from the beginning, and how the inequality of the world that was written into this system can only really be dismantled with genuine decolonization and recognizing that those imperial structures that are still present within the international sphere.
Yeah, it's interesting that you actually now brought up the discourse of decolonization. And while the global South, we here in the global South have the shared experience of being colonized for centuries, by the global north, the so-called European powers, um, there had been much of a talk about the kind of decolonization in the Israel and Palestine issues. And you mentioned also the so-called failure of international system, that it has a historical roots in it. And as, I mean, if we look at how the Western government support the presence of Israel, it's somehow using the logics of racial capitalism. And it seems like these are the remnants of the old colonial imperialism in Israel still lingers, mixed with secular Zionism, mixed with somehow this religious justification to ethnic cleansing against the Palestine. And I mean, in terms of the racial capitalism, in terms of the imperialism, I think it's also important to highlight the fact that Israeli economy was built in the forced labor, the so-called system of land dispossessions against the Palestinians, against the Arab Palestinians, while at the same time racialize the Arabs, discriminate against them. And so this Israeli economy and Israeli as a nation state itself is actually has a value through the dispossessions of the Palestinian and the labor of the Palestinian. So this is the kind of a contour of labor exploitation from the lens of racial capitalism, that Israel's dependent on Palestinian workers, in particular from Gaza, for their construction and agricultural product. And I think that triggers the late Intifada, I mean, the first Intifada in the late 1980s, that kind of also a backdrop of the emergence of Hamas as forces of resistance. And, you know, and so just connected to that historical trajectory, there have been then criticism against the Western hypocrisy and the compliance to Gaza genocide. And although it is not unique, I think, this Western hypocrisy, I mean, the Western countries, they have, you know, military support or even proxy war in Africa, in Asia. They've been doing that for so many years. And so do you think that today's momentum in this since the October 7th, the world uprising against this injustice, do you think this momentum is different than before to challenge the so-called new colonialism, new imperialism, and the failure of international system?
I would like to be hopeful. You know, like you said, I think there's like some bright lights at the end of the tunnel, like a very long tunnel after a lot of hopelessness and a lot of despair that people are feeling. So I think we have to hope that at the end of all of this, we can find our way out to something that is better and fairer system, and that at least the injustices like you're talking about, that the Palestinians and other countries that have suffered from this same kind of colonial playbook, those injustices will be rectified in some way. But I think it's going to be a long road, and what the momentum that we have now, I think, whilst it's very critical, it needs to be perhaps a little bit more honest about you know, it's very critical of, oh, look, Israel and the US don't respect the international system. But I think we need to think, okay, but why, you know, why has that been allowed to happen? If this was any other country, this wouldn't have been the case. What is we need to look at, yes, the setup of the international system and consider how effective that actually is. And if we are even, you know, and I think and many people, I think within organizations like the UN, you know, I think there is an expectation among many people in terms of, and I'm speaking more about the public here, that the international system does operate with a degree of fairness, and that we should be able to expect fair judgment and organization from it. That illusion has been debunked, but I think we need to be more critical about the origins of this system. And like you said, the injustices and racial inequalities that persist as a result of colonialism, and looking at how the international system was never truly able to uproot that, rectify that, and think about what steps are actually needed in order to decolonize that system from the root and start giving actual agency to people in the global south to be able to organize on their own terms. And I would, talk about this very particularly from the perspective of Muslim countries, where the nation state system that has dominated over the past 70 years has been used as a way to sort of keep different parts of the Muslim world divided. And we see this right now in relation to the Palestinian context, where Jordan next door, which has a population that is 70% originally Palestinians, is still considered a separate country to Palestine, and therefore should have its own interests, even if they are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. This is something that ultimately is instituted by the nation state system that has normalized this as the default way of international organization. And perhaps now that we are more skeptical about some kinds of international organization, we as people in the global south and as Muslims can broaden our political imaginations to start to envisage different ways of empowering ourselves based on different forms of unity and political action in the future. But I think that is a long road. We shall have to, inshallah, see. I think that's a long-term plan, but at the same time, we have to start working towards it within our own discourses now, at the very least.
So if we follow the dynamics of the solidarity movement for Palestine in the West, we will encounter the term of progressive except Palestine or progressive except for Palestine, or PEP, which is the term is used to describe how people who identify their political position in the so-called progressive, either in the left or liberal wing, but at the same time, they do not express support for Palestine or comment on Israel crimes. So, how did this PEP come to be, and what is its ideological and historical root, according to Aisha observation?
Yeah, this is a very interesting dynamic, and the progressive accept Palestine as a term, I think, is really useful in highlighting the hypocrisy that has been observed by many so-called liberals or left-wing advocates when it comes to the Palestinian cause. This phenomena is one that I think is fairly common in the West up until now. I would say that's the default position, where Israel has always been the exception to left-wing institutions. And I think this is really because of Europe's own legacy of the Holocaust. There are still Holocaust survivors who are alive today who remember fleeing from their homes and the pogroms in Europe that chased them out. We know many of the descendants of those who died in concentration camps, and they remember their parents and their grandparents' stories. So in many ways, that trauma is still very much alive in Europe as a whole, in terms of that history being actually quite recent. And because Israel was then cast as the solution to that, and the way that Europe can atone for its crimes, because let's remember that while they like to now throw the allegation of anti-Semitism around at Muslims or Palestinian supporters and people in the global south, it was Europeans who were actually, up until the last 70 years, the most virulently anti-Semitic, and chased them literally out of their lands. And because Israel was then sort of the solution for that, and the way for them to say that, oh, look, we are now supporting the Jewish people and the Jewish state, criticism of Israel was traditionally off the table, even within left-wing circles. And there was this intentional conflation in many ways by many politicians and by many lobby groups between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, to prevent any criticism that if you want to be anti-Zionist, well, you can't be that, because then you'd be anti-Semitic. So in the West, being progressive or left-wing wasn't about standing against settler colonialism when Israel is doing it. It was about favoring economic policies that reduced inequality or promoted diversity and inclusion. It wasn't about radical liberation from capitalism and imperialism. But this is something that I would say we're seeing more now from the younger generation of millennials and Gen Z, with their activism for decolonization, where they are actually recognizing the biases that have been built into the world that were previously taken for granted, and that actually emerged as a result of the European historical experience, whether that is the experience of them as colonizing powers or their history of them perpetuating genocides like the Holocaust. But ultimately now, people are realizing, well, Europe's historical experience does not need to determine the lines of engagement that activists or progressive movements have. And I think that's why that we've seen a growing intolerance in places like the US of politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from her supporter base, who are not happy with her response to the genocide and calling it out quite late, and her continued support for Biden, because they expected better from her. The younger generation who didn't expect her to inherit that that progressive except Palestine line that I think a lot of other liberals had to keep to. So that discourse definitely has been there, but I feel now we are challenging that more than we've ever seen before.
So, along with the presence of the EPEP, the October 7 also full a movement urging anyone with privilege, authority, and influence to publicly state their position on the situation in Palestine today. However, at the same time, we see that when people speak out strongly in favor of Palestine, there's so much intimidation and marginalization that they receive, such as dismissal, blacklisting from certain communities, and anti-Semitic accusation that Sister Aisha also mentioned earlier. So how could this happen in these times, Sister Aisha?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts on this as well. But to me, this was honestly a reversion to the very standard playbook of what deaths are deserving of most humanity. We unfortunately live in a world of conscious and unconscious white privilege, where Black and brown people are continually dehumanized in public life. And the colonial project was literally built on that, right? It was built on these assumptions that different races were actually subhuman. And the experimentation that was done on Black and brown people in the colonies and afterwards are, I think, only just being made widely known today. But we have recorded in the history books the human zoos, for example, that were prominent in the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe and elsewhere, that were designed to show the superiority of white Western culture versus the savages of Africa, South America, Asia, the Middle East. And while these exhibits, exhibits that were that extreme are obviously, a thing of the past. We don't have human zoos today, but Orientalist and racist portrayals of non-white people are very common in modern media, both in entertainment media and in the news that we consume. So is it shocking that, the events of October 7th, many of which were ridiculously exaggerated and have been since proven false, such as all of the myths surrounding, the beheaded and burned babies, is it surprising that that prompted more sympathy than images of brown children being literally starved to death? Even, the week that we're recording this, as we said, these 7 aid workers who hailed from various different Western states that have now been killed, that has brought condemnation and demands for a ceasefire from Western commentators and Western governments who have remained silent all this time over the deaths of 20,000 brown women and children. People who look like Europeans and Americans, who often speak English, and in the case of 5 million Israelis, are dual citizens of other largely Western states. These are the people who, in the eyes of Westerners, are far more deserving of humanity than brown people, especially those who belong to a religion, that is Islam, that is dismissed by them as backward, oppressive, and inherently violent. And honestly, it's been laughable but incredibly depressing to see the moral quandaries that Western organizations will get themselves into in order to back up this perspective. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't just completely disgraceful. But there are many the news networks have been challenged internally, because in many cases they've taken editorial decisions to not use words like massacre or slaughter to describe incidents of mass death in Gaza, because it's argued that this killing, this death, was conducted remotely, obviously, because the Israeli military is killing them from afar. And so this does not carry the same brutality that warrants those descriptions. And this is just bias at its finest. I mean, anyone who's seen the images or the videos coming out of Gaza would be convinced that we are witnessing some of the most brutal, horrific, and savage atrocities of our age. The fact that Israel has managed to accomplish that remotely does not make it any less vicious. It just means that they've honed their expertise in inflicting that level of barbarism from a distance. Shooting from the air is no less devastating than shooting on the ground. People are still dying, and dying in incredibly painful ways. And there is manifest evidence of the dehumanizing and genocidal intent of these attacks, again, not just from Israeli government, but also from soldiers committing these acts themselves, who are happy to film themselves committing these war crimes, in situations where clearly civilians have been murdered by them, including children, in cold blood. So the choice of Western media to not use this language is to undermine the severity of Israeli crimes while amplifying the actions of the Palestinians. And as much as, we're talking about how this has, Israel's reputation has been destroyed, and I think a lot more people are aware of the crimes, there is definitely greater awareness for sure. But among certain demographics, according to a recent study by Pew Research Center, they found that 50% of Americans actually do not know which side has experienced more death, Israelis or Palestinians. We know the official death toll from Israel is 1,200, and the death toll of Palestinians is more than 30,000. It's absolutely shocking. And this is a view that is probably more prominent among the older generation, who are not getting information from social media, so they're not having their assumptions questioned, and they're not seeing alternative media. But it reflects how, because of the choices being made by legacy media, who are presenting these facts as per the status quo of the Western narrative, how that actually affects the even understanding of the, bare facts on the ground, let alone then who people end up having sympathy with. So this, I think, goes back to as well your point earlier, Rizky, about the racial capitalist undertones that have been present in this conflict from earlier on, that really need to be recognized if we're going to sort of make some progress after this in changing those narratives from the root.
We also observed that the October 7 attacks also had at least fundamentally shift the view towards Hamas and the armed resistance movement. So we see that the public at large began to realize that the question, but do you condemn Hamas, was effective to justify the genocide committed against the Palestinian people. So this realization, we think, has run a wider public awareness that the GWOT agenda launched by the US after 9/11 has globally damaged not only Palestine but also countries from Iraq to Afghanistan, like we see in the news brutally. So Judith Butler, U.S. post-structuralist and feminist, even explicitly called the Hamas attack as an act of armed resistance, not just terrorism that many Westerner will say about Hamas. However, this view has been heavily criticized in the West, that most liberals have gone as far as calling it as morally bankrupt. So we also see that many people still confused about their attitude and opinion towards Hamas attack on Israel. This important thing to ask, that why is liberation in today's world seen as a less noble goal than non-violent peace for many people?
Yeah. I mean, the military wing of Hamas is a prescribed terror organization by the UK and the US. And I think that, you've mentioned the global war on terror there, that obviously the US started after 9/11. I think in the psyche of the Western world at large, since 9/11 and the global war on terror, the idea that something is a terrorist group, I think, is it has taken on a meaning and is understood in the psyche of the public at large that there is no justification for any of this. And you know what? If we even start to try and engage with the reasons behind people's discontent and why these terror attacks happen, we are justifying terrorism, right? And this, I think, was very there. And this, I think, started very much during the George Bush administration, where he was, very famous for saying we don't negotiate with terrorists. And there's almost this idea that if somebody is a terrorist, they are now completely subhuman, they've committed these terrible atrocities, we're not even going to try and engage, they just deserve to be destroyed. And obviously this is not, no one here is trying to defend acts of terrorism. That's, I think, something fairly obvious that doesn't need to be stated, but unfortunately does need to be stated because many people would like to portray Muslim women talking about non-state violence as justifying terrorism. So obviously nobody is here trying to defend terrorism, but there is something to be said about the way in which that label is used to shut down any conversation about why people feel discontented, right? And why violent resistance actually occurs. And it's important to remember that the Palestinians themselves, as a group under occupation, under international law, do have a right to resistance against their occupying power. Again, obviously that's not to justify terrorism, but we need to interrogate how these words are being used and how this discourse is being applied when it comes to Palestine. And this backdrop is also then accompanied by what we've just been talking about in terms of the dehumanization of Palestinians themselves. And this has played a huge part in the way this issue is perceived. You say, why is liberation seen as a less noble goal than nonviolent peace? I think for many people that's the case because this is not seen as a liberatory struggle. It's seen as Israel, a Western-aligned state and allegedly the only democracy in the Middle East, being threatened by a group of people who are inherently violent terrorists over a historic religious claim that they say that they have over the land. For a lot of people, as was made clear after October 7th, all of this only started on October 7th and started with, therefore, do you condemn Hamas's attack on Israel? And Israel's previous crimes and constant breaches of international law for the past 76 years are considered ancient history that isn't relevant, or even if we say, oh, you know what, okay, illegal settlements are illegal international law, but nothing justifies terrorism. And so the Palestinians are still on the back foot. They are still the ones who have committed the greater wrong. And additionally, I think, again, taking a step back and looking at the system as a whole, when we look at conflicts around the world today, we can definitely say that the West behaves and speaks as though they have the only legitimacy to enact violence. We see this in relation to Ukraine, and we see that after the Hamas attacks, the discourse from West politicians focused on Israel's right to defend itself. The Palestinians do not have the right to defend themselves, even though technically, according to international law, that they do. But in the mainstream, war in the West feels distant, it feels moral, it's allegedly proportionate, while action from non-Western actors, particularly non-state actors, is almost always considered terrorism by default until proven otherwise. And this really seems to suggest that oppressed peoples, non-white oppressed peoples, have to be perfect victims in order for the world to sympathize with their plight, and that their response to oppression should be pacifism, despite the violence that they have to face every day. And whilst I don't think that obviously any of us here want to live in a world where violence is the norm and we can sympathize with all loss of life, we cannot allow someone to take away the rights of others and then expect that this is not going to provoke a response from the oppressed people. That's just not the reality of the world. And it becomes very difficult for people who are not part of a conflict to start to dictate to others who are facing violence every single day how they should respond. obviously violence against innocent people is never acceptable, but very often the insistence that other people on the sidelines will have that resistance should only take place in a very specific way serves actually to serves the oppressor.
Yes, I think it is very ironic that the fact that as a Muslim, a visible Muslim, either you're brown or you have beard, or especially if you're hijab, you have to be sort of like apologetic, and you have to keep reminding to the public that, oh, we don't condemn terrorism, we don't this, we don't that, just to comply to the some kind of a standard moral of, it seems like we are easily targeted as either anti-Semitism, or when we talk about self-defense or the international law and the rise to self-defense for the Palestinian, we need to be pacifist, like you mentioned. And so I remember when the October 7th occurred, I was suddenly, have this thought that, okay, this will be huge. The Israeli force will not let this just in silence. They will have a really, I think, a massive revenge towards the Palestinians. And that happened in, like you mentioned, this is unprecedented scale of massacre. And yet still, there is a pressure to keep on saying that we are anti-violence, because we are anti-violence, but how do we explain, that we have the rights to self-defense? And it's interesting that finally the words of like people reminding how Nelson Mandela used to be labeled as terrorist, but then, during the apartheid, but then now the international community acknowledge him as an international hero. So I just want to bring this back into the issues of the global South, that there is, I think it's also ironic in the way that many or leaders in the Latin America or South American countries speak clearly about their stance for Palestine. And South Africa, we all witness how, they actually struggle for the case of Israel in ICJ. And we have Anwar Ibrahim in Malaysia speak even clearly that he support Hamas as a legitimate political forces as well. While at the same time, I mean, in other parts of the world, like especially in Indonesia, for example, we are one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, but we see like a different kind of magnitude of expressions of solidarity with Palestine. In the West, and even in Yemen or in Egypt, in Jordan even, the people, they go down to the street, they have a strong demonstrations to support the Palestine. In Indonesia, we only have like a couple of big events, massive rally by the Muslim groups, and a few smaller actions by NGO and left-leaning groups. And do you think this situation of solidarity movement in the global North or in the West also kind of reflect or have this experience in Indonesia with the kind of fragmentations? But I remember one of the words from Imam Tom Fakini. He said that the Muslims in the United States has a bigger responsibility to protest against Israel, because different in global South countries, all the strong resources and power are there in the United States, and therefore the Muslims have more responsibility to advocate and to protest against this. How do you perceive that? And maybe you can give us insights about how different groups in the global North, in the Western countries, allied with each other in Palestinian solidarity movement.
Yeah. I think that Imam Tom Fachin's statement is definitely true there. I think Muslims in states that in general have a higher degree of freedom of speech, and also have, definitely in the case of the US, US tax dollars are paying for this genocide, definitely have a greater responsibility to make sure that they are making their voices heard and doing whatever they can to change that to change that support for Israel that is being given by the states that they're living in. It's also something that I think, just as much as we are looking and seeing some of these protests from places like Jordan and Egypt, they are being met with very severe repression from the state, because the state does not actually want them to show their discontent that much. If they're showing their discontent just towards Israel, that's just about acceptable. But when they start showing their discontent towards their own leaders in action on the Palestinian issue and their refusal to give adequate support to the Palestinians, that is when they will be, that their protest is no longer tolerated. So definitely those of us in countries, and particularly people in the West who have allegedly anyway, the right to freedom of speech, making their voices heard is incredibly important. But I think in general, we have seen, I would say, quite a lot of unity and a lot of action at this point in time in the West among varied groups. There are definitely prominent Muslim organizations who are at the forefront of organizing some of these protests, of organizing the Palestine Solidarity Campaign that we have in the UK. However, that is also backed by an array of non-Muslim organizations as well. And of course, therefore, there are divisions, as within any broad-based movement, in terms of the fact that people probably do not agree when you get down to the when you get down to the nitty-gritty of, what a solution should look like, or what is the right way for example, a free Palestine to be organized or managed or governed. But right now, the focus has been on getting a permanent ceasefire and ending Western support for the occupation, so that the people of Palestine can then make that decision themselves. And I think it's impressive how many groups have been able to unify on that issue without making any very particular demands on the Palestinians, that only if they are shown to be supporters of this or supporters of that will we also come and support you. It's been quite refreshing, I think, definitely seeing some people comment on this on social media, where Israelis have attempted to discourage support for Palestinians by often emphasizing the fact that as Muslims and that, because of their Islamic identity, it's, unlikely that they would, for example, support other progressive causes in the West, like, for example, the LGBT movement. And so, some of the information and the propaganda coming from Israel is, these people are anti-LGBT, while all of the left-wing progressive movements in the West supporting them. And sometimes, you see on social media people responding and they're like, that's their values. We don't necessarily need to have a conversation about that now, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with them about social issues like the LGBT movement, does not mean that they deserve to be living under occupation and facing a genocide. And that has been something that has been very refreshing to see, that there's at least a common humanity that people are able to unify around and direct their action towards, to at least save lives. However, one particular sort of fault line or fragmentation that I think we do face in the West is a broader problem, that while many of those who support Palestine are those who do so on the basis that this is an anti-imperialist struggle and that Israel is an outpost of Western imperialism in the Middle East. And so the US and Israel are cast as this original evil, that everybody who's with them are the bad guys and everyone who is against them are considered the good guys. And this often leads many of the strongest supporters of the Palestinians to ignore the crimes of other regimes against Muslims. So, for example, those who support many of these people will still support Russia and the Syrian government in its brutal response to the Arab Spring and the civil war that has lasted since then. many of these individuals will deny the reports of China's detainment of Muslims and its treatment of minority groups in the country. And this is problematic because for us as Muslims, at least, the blood of our brothers and sisters everywhere in the world is sacred to us. And this has to be a red line. All the loss of human life is obviously bad. But where people are, we cannot side with anybody who is conducting this kind of these kind of campaigns or wars against other Muslims. And just because a country like Russia has condemned Israel does not mean that it's not also capable of committing horrendous crimes against Muslims elsewhere, whether that's people in Syria or against people more generally, such as in Ukraine. So if we truly stand for justice, we as Muslims need to speak against all of that and not just get into this binary of, oh, the West is evil and everyone that is against the West is good. Unfortunately, people everywhere and countries and governments everywhere are capable of committing crimes, and we should be people who stand for justice in every single situation and not see a contradiction in calling out the US and Israel and also calling out a country like Russia. But this is something that others within the pro-Palestinian movement, I would say, their political analysis, their ideological viewpoint directs them in that line. And that is sometimes unfortunate. And I know many Syrians in the West and elsewhere who feel very betrayed by those who support, by many of the supporters of Palestine, because they have actually propped up the lies and misinformation that Russia and the Syrian government have spread about the crimes that they have committed against the Syrian people. And it's very disappointing when somebody who supports Palestine can very clearly see the crimes Israel has committed, cannot see the crimes that other regimes are committing against Muslims elsewhere.
For people in the global South, it's also easy to be very black and white about this situation. Like you said, that just because Russia is opponent to United States and with the charisma of Putin, then you become pro-Russians. And just because the Chinese government, they don't repress they take a stance, I think, for the Palestine in the UN. And just because of that, then we think that the Uyghur cases will be wiped away. So this kind of binary thinking I think is also very risky in Muslim societies. And I want to actually ask you something about the concept of ummah. I think you kind of your explanations about these issues, I think it's interesting to also discuss about the concept of ummah, but that maybe we can discuss later on. I just want to raise the questions about in terms of the feminist movement, because we have talked about the social movement, the various protests from the different spectrum. Even the left-leaning groups have its own kind of ambiguity towards the Palestinian. And in particular, what do you think about the mainstream feminist movement in the West? Rigza mentioned about Judith Butler, which I think it's one out of very few feminists who actually speak out on this matter in a boldly matter. And especially the Muslim feminists, we haven't heard that anything from them in terms of their public statement or anything that they speak in the West voicing solidarity for Palestine, or whether they are very small in numbers that they kind of blend in with broader social movement or broader Islamic organizations. Or do you think, is there any symptom of progressive except Palestine that that occur among them? This is also, I think, we can reflect that in Indonesia as well later on.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear the experience from both of you of how this is playing out in Indonesia. I think you're right, though, Rizky, in that there has been a real lack of response from feminists in general in voicing solidarity with Palestinian women. I think, I mean, I can't speak to particular instances of many Muslim feminists, just because aside from a few academics who wouldn't necessarily comment on every single political situation, although you would think that everybody has a responsibility to speak up against a genocide, they wouldn't, but if they wouldn't sort of generally comment on issues like this, there's not a huge group or many groups of Muslim feminists otherwise that I would have expected to hear from. I'm sure that there has been some sympathy broadly, of course, though, from all Muslim organizations. But in terms of feminists at large, I think we haven't seen, voices being very clearly raised in defense of Palestinian women. And the abuses that Israel has committed against Palestinian women are not just limited to this war. The reports of abuse, harassment, and rape in Israeli prisons have been made before. And there are even more insidious ways that this abuse affects all of Palestinian society. There was an American anthropologist, David Graeber, who wrote in 2015 about how women's hair salons in the West Bank are hidden behind, you won't find them on the main street. And when you do go and, actually find them and able to go in because you have a hair appointment, they no longer serve tea to their female customers. And this is because in the 1980s, Mossad agents would spike the tea in women's hair salons, in Palestinian women's hair salons, with knockout drugs. And they would then proceed to take nude pictures of Palestinian women, which would later be used to blackmail their family members into becoming informants. And Graeber actually thought this sounded like a bit of a paranoid myth, but he went and found that there was evidence of this, of Mossad agents confessing anonymously that they had, that this was a practice that they used to rely on. And so as a result, for Palestinian women and hair salons, they no longer serve tea. Something that seems so simple, but actually has an extremely dark history behind it. But that is, something that women have had to live with, I think, for a very long time. In the past couple of weeks, we've heard more recent accounts. Of course, UN experts have received credible accounts of rape and other women being threatened with sexual violence. I think it is important to note that one account of a pregnant woman being raped in front of her family was not one of the verified incidents that was reported. And I say that because I think we, on the Palestinian side, do not need to invent atrocities in order to garner public sympathy. If a rumor is unsubstantiated, we have no problems with calling that out. And we understand that a certain standard of evidence needs to be met for a claim to be credible. And this is in contrast to most Israeli accounts of sexual violence, where no substantial evidence has been provided of the mass systematic rapes that were alleged to have taken place during the October 7th attacks, despite those unconfirmed reports being repeated thousands of times by news agencies and politicians to this day. And in contrast, we have actually seen some of the most publicized cases of alleged rapes have been subsequently debunked. And this has been confirmed by several investigations. Most recently, I think Al Jazeera Investigations also did a documentary on this, where they highlighted many of the problems in the narratives that were coming out after those attacks. But nevertheless, obviously, today we're looking at the situation in Gaza, and there have been multiple reports of women in custody facing sexual violence from Israeli soldiers. But the situation that women and mothers are facing more generally is extremely dire. At least 184 women give birth every day in Gaza, and they are now mostly giving birth to underweight babies without any medication. There have been reports of women undergoing cesarean operations without any anesthesia. Premature babies have increased by 30%, and at least 155,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are at high risk of malnutrition. This is absolutely catastrophic in that the long-term effects of that on a generation of women and girls cannot be understated. But this information is deliberately shelved by mainstream media networks who don't think it newsworthy enough, and also by women's organizations who you would think have something to say about that. But unfortunately, there's been silence from many of those prominent advocacy groups. But this is, again, unsurprising given all of the context that we've been talking about in the conversation thus far, in terms of the extent to which Palestinian women have been erased from the conversation, where they are presented as oppressed Muslim women who do not have a voice or humanity of their own. And so they're considered unrelatable and thus unworthy victims to many onlookers, and not worth advocacy and feminist organizations coming out and speaking in their defense. It's a huge shame. But I wonder if in Indonesia, what you feel the response has been from Muslim feminist organizations.
It's really sad and very upsetting, the fact that women and children in Gaza, their photos are all around, like 24 hours in social media after the 7th of October as a victims. They cried for their loved ones, or they witnessed and they actually experienced themselves the really hard, violent atrocities. And still, there is no loud and clear and strong voice of the feminist movement. And we have UN Security Council resolutions about women, peace, and security. After the Srebrenica massacre in the 1990s, and they have this UN resolution in 2000, I think, for the involvement of women in peace and security. Yet, any institutions or any advocacy that claims on behalf of the WPS discourse, I haven't heard anything of them speaking about women in Palestine now. And so it's really, I think it's closely connected with, like you mentioned precisely, about these women are right in our face, but they are silenced. It seems like they are invisible. They're just become another news to display, and no strong voice to defend them. What happened with this feminist movement? What happened with the narrative, with the discourse, with their loud voice, like they did during the Me Too movement? Or, you know, yeah, during the 70s, for example, we have strong feminist movement against, like, Vietnam War, for example. Whatever happened to women in Palestine? If the Western feminists wants to liberate us, the Muslim women, from our oppressor, from our male Muslim oppressor, and I mean, how would they? This is like the double standard, the weird advocacy or moral values of the so-called Western secular liberal feminists. I mean, this is not a universal criticism towards feminism. We do believe that there are values of solidarity in feminism that we can also learn a lot from. There are values and philosophy and even advocacy that we can all learn from feminism. So, we haven't heard much about why Muslim organizations or feminist organizations in Indonesia speak about Palestine, because the Palestine issue is also can be very easily labeled into, oh, this is the right spectrum of or this is the radical conservative Muslim discourse who are advocating for Palestine. And so there is this kind of easily labeling of Muslims whenever they speak about Palestine, and some would say, oh, that is not religious, there's nothing religious. This is just pure about the fight against land, for example. Or even there are some who actually feel Palestine is okay, there's no issue with Palestine, or even pro-Israel. And we have, well, to be honest, I mean, Indonesian government have kind of, I think, trade also cooperation with Israel, but it is not outspokenly mentioned. And we have people, Muslim leaders who invited to Israel and, become very friendly with Israel instead of having the strong stance for Palestine. I mean, under the banner of peaceful tolerance and, the Abrahamic faith, let's don't do any resistance against occupations or those kind of things. And even we found big Islamic preachers affiliated with major Islamic organizations. Like I said earlier, that Al-Aqsa and Palestine were fine. And I think this is kind of a bit depressing to some extent. And in your observation, why do you think this kind of thing happen in global South, in countries with large Muslim communities and with shared experience of colonialism?
Yeah, this is, extremely disappointing to hear. And I am also confused as to how a country that boasts the highest Muslim population in the world, could not see that could not see that significant mobilization against an occupation is a cause that should, attract widespread support. And it's also particularly sad because as Muslims, this is a duty that other co-believers have on us, and as much as you said, some people say, they're wary of turning it into a Muslim issue. I don't think that we should shy away from identifying it as a Muslim issue. It's not just a Muslim issue. It can be relevant to many other people who identify with that struggle for justice and that resistance to settler colonialism. But it is a Muslim issue because it involves Muslims, and it also happens to involve the third holiest site in Islam. That doesn't necessarily, that's not trying to erase the presence of Palestinian Christians, but in terms of looking at it as at the numbers level, there is that, it's a majority Muslim population, Palestinians are, and they have themselves often mobilized behind Islamic values and Islamic slogans and things like that. So we don't need to erase their Muslimness in order to be an acceptable cause any more than other people need to erase their humanity in also or be Muslim in order to feel sympathetic for Palestine. Those two things can coexist at the same time. But as Muslims, then, when we look at it, okay, we look at it with the humanitarian lens, but we also look at it with the Muslim lens, remembering that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, described the ummah as one body, that when one part is suffering from some illness or disease, the rest of the body shakes with pain and restlessness. And he is making this comparison to show that if Muslims in one place are suffering, that deserves the attention, sympathy, and efforts to improve that situation from other Muslims within the ummah, wherever else in the world that they may be. So this is something that we definitely need to consider as a priority, not just from for those who happen to be interested in politics or interested in the Middle East or interested in colonialism, but actually as Muslims, this is an obligation that we have to think about because these people are suffering and in such a significant place on top of that to us as Muslims. You mentioned about the trade relations between Indonesia and Israel. And this is, also very unfortunate and is obviously, of course, not unique to Indonesia at all. And the trade relations are, in my opinion, the first area where we need to see some kind of action taken by Muslim countries. It's unconscionable, really, that amid a worldwide consumer boycott of companies that support the occupation, that is having some success, whether it's in the stock value of some of these corporations. Yesterday, I heard that McDonald's is intending to buy back all of its franchises in Israel because the damage that has been done by the Israeli franchise in providing free meals to IDF soldiers provoked a widespread boycott, and they're trying to, make up for that now. So amid everybody else in the world thinking about how we can't buy Coke, we can't buy this, we can't buy that, Muslim states are continuing to supply Israel with the resources that they need to commit a genocide. If not now, then when? What is going to stop them? And I mean, instead of even any consideration of that, we see yesterday that the UAE ambassador to Israel actually attended an iftar event that was held by the Israeli government and was pictured sitting next to Israeli President Herzog. This comes after the Emirates had even hosted another Israeli delegation in December. This is an absolute outrage. It's the complete opposite of what we'd expect from Muslim leaders around the world, who should be cooperating and doing everything they can do to pressure Israel to stop starving the Palestinians. Instead, we see them sitting and eating with them, eating iftar with them. How can anybody think that that is something that is acceptable at any moral, political, religious standpoint? It's absolutely unacceptable. And I think that many,
starvation, right? I mean, this is like a
yeah,
really horrible starvation in Gaza now. And they're
yeah,
having dinner with the enemy, which I mean,
literally you're having dinner with the enemy who happens to be not just, and the fact that, like you're saying, you know, starvation is the weapon of war that they are choosing just makes it all the more ironic and disgusting. But unfortunately, that is what we are expecting of some of these Muslim leaders today. And I think that many Muslims are confused when they see this kind of behavior, particularly as well, of course, the neighboring countries doing nothing. And, you know, many people point to Egypt. They say Egypt has a border with Gaza. Why is it not letting the aid in? You know, Israel has cooperated with Egypt for many years now to ensure that that border remains closed, except in the most dire circumstances. But why could they not, you know, defy what Israel tells them to do? Why could they not do it? Many people think that it's because, you know, they're unable to do that. But that's not the reason. It's not because they can't or that they're scared. It's actually because their interests as politicians and heads of state, heads of secular nation states, it's not in their interest to transcend the borders of their countries and make these sacrifices for the sake of Allah, for the sake of helping their brothers and sisters in Islam, that especially when it could provoke some kind of reaction from Israel. And even when their people are demanding action, when you have these mass protests in Jordan and in Egypt, they are more concerned at quashing that sentiment and not making those protests become too popular, become too prominent, than actually taking even the smallest of actions against Israel itself. And really, I think this genocide has underscored again the fact that Muslim political leaders do not represent the ummah or its interests in the slightest. And this is something that really needs to change. And then just lastly, you know, you mentioned about certain Muslim organizations that are even seeking peace with Israel and whether this is something that we see in other countries. This is something that we have seen in the West too, and it has been bolstered especially by Israeli lobby groups. They often organize strategic interfaith partnerships and arrange trips to Israel. They take Muslim community leaders to Israel on these state-funded trips, and they say that we will show you both sides. They make them go and meet people on the Palestinian side, and they show them people on the Israeli side, and they have, you know, lots of well-organized lunches and interesting tourism, interesting tours around the historical sites in Jerusalem. And luckily, these initiatives have been rejected almost entirely by Muslim communities in the West. Those community leaders that do take part in them are often on the fringe already, and they have been met with severe pushback often when they return. But the idea that people in and community leaders or scholars in Muslim countries would be also echoing that same rhetoric of, oh, actually, the situation is not as bad as we think. Al-Aqsa is fine. You know, the issue is more complicated. Both sides need to come to the table. That's very disappointing to hear, but is something that should, of course, be met with more pushback from all of us who are able to see that that is clearly not the case.
But also, it's interesting that I want to bring this to the you mentioned about, yes, there is a religious basis on why we defend the Palestine. In addition to so many other factors, it's because, yes, this is the third holy site of Islam. We have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we have the Isra Mi'raj. So this is the land of the blessed, where Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam also mentioned so many times in his hadith. So there is this religious elements that we cannot dismiss as well, and particularly this Ramadan we witness the atrocities against our Muslim brothers and sisters there. So I just want to bring this to your activities. You are currently part of the Ummatics Institute research organization. I think also have a broad and rich discourse about the contemporary ummah, or rethinking the discourse of ummah. What is it? What is ummah for the Muslim communities around the world nowadays? It seems like a very distant, ancient time, or a very abstract ideas. The fact that, like you mentioned, people don't believe in boycott, for example, or there is this argument that if I boycott McD or other fast food restaurants that support Israel, then how about the fate of the working class who work in these fast food restaurants, and Indonesian workers who lost their job if these restaurants or business is no longer operates in Indonesia? So people could see it maybe it's true to some extent, but the way that it is being argued that, you can eat somewhere else. People who lost their jobs can still live, but these people in Palestine, they were killed by the machines, by the soldiers who fed by the McD. Anyway, coming back to that, I also noticed that you mentioned about LGBT communities. Like, it seems like there is this campaign against pro-Palestine, that these Palestinians are extremists, and and Muslim communities, they don't support LGBT issues, while the left-leaning groups, the leftists, are pro-LGBT. So, how could you support Palestine who are against the LGBT rights? But again, you highlight that this is not a matter of different values, different perspectives towards several issues, but this is a very basic, very common sense consciousness, universal rights, that you cannot kill people, you cannot ethnic cleansing people, you cannot massacre people, no matter different values or way of life or religion they have. You just can't kill people indiscriminately. So talking about ummah, you also, like, in Ummatics, and you in the Qarawiyyin Project, tell us more about the kind of roots, the Islamic historical roots, and the ideas of ummah that we can have nowadays, and how do we build a global movement? It can be revolutionary movement together on the Palestine issues, and how the concept of ummah, us as a Muslim, extend solidarity for Palestine to other regions as well, like in Kashmir, in Sudan, or in non-Muslim majority countries like Congo or West Papua.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is sort of the core question, to be honest, that as Muslims observing this war, and also other conflicts, as you're saying, that are happening around the world, what should our response be? And as much as, obviously, as Muslims, we all have our own individual identities that are tied to the places that we come from, that are tied to the ethnic groups that we belong to, Islam and the Quran makes it very clear that as people who believe in the message of Islam, we are one body, we are one united people, and that we have common responsibilities and rights towards one another. One of those rights is that we support one another during times of suffering, but more broadly, we should also be a unified community, such that when we are able to enact that support, not just that, oh, we are, so divided, and then if somebody needs help, how do we mobilize to help them? No, we should be mobilized and unified from the off, so that so that we are able to grow and prosper together as a community. And it's unfortunate that obviously today this concept feels very abstract and distant to people, because Muslim countries are divided into 50 plus different nation states. We are all told that we have different flags, different national anthems, and that these are the things that define us. But actually, when we are going to be standing in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment, those differentiations are not how He's going to judge us. He's going to judge us on our beliefs and how closely we followed His instructions to mankind and showed that sympathy for our fellow believers and fellow people around the world. So the mission of us as an ummah is to promote this unified approach to an Islamic civilization, where we recognize that our strength lies in our unity and in our diversity within that. It's not about everybody being the same, but trying to find out how we can support one another and uplift and empower one another, particularly given the many different struggles that Muslims are facing around the world today. The Ummatics Institute, as you've mentioned, does produce literature for this purpose that is aimed at promoting a unified Islamic civilization. People, inshallah, can visit our website to perhaps find out more about that if they are interested. But it is fundamentally about trying to find a way that we as Muslims can govern our collective affairs, with ummatics acting as this umbrella term for the beliefs and practices of the ummah. And that includes various branches, of course, the socio-cultural, the political, the economic, religious affairs. But this is a discourse that we as Muslims around the world are engaging in, a transnational discourse, to try and conceptualize and realize greater integration between Muslim regions in the hope of creating that a more prosperous and virtuous civilization. And this is a responsibility that we have, among ourselves, as I've mentioned, but it also is a responsibility that we have to the rest of the world. When you mention how, can we build a sort of a global movement together for other causes that need our solidarity, and there are many, ranging from obviously still Muslim causes like the Kashmir issue, which obviously is facing a very similar occupation to Palestine, and increasingly shows very similar parallels, where people look at Zionist extremists and see the impact of that on the Palestinians. We see very similar behavior from Hindu extremists in India, and how they are targeting minorities, particularly Muslim communities and mosques, over the past several years. So that's a cause that also needs our attention. And that is a cause that as an ummah, we recognize these are also Muslim people who are suffering. We can build solidarity to that based on that basis. But even for other causes that don't necessarily have a Muslim dimension to them, these are still causes that we as Muslims should be concerned about. We should be, as believers, a people of justice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes us in the Quran as witnesses over mankind who should encourage what is good and forbid what is wrong. So we should see ourselves as a unified ummah, as a driving force for justice in the world, not just onlookers that when evil occurs and, oh, that's happening in a faraway place, it's got nothing to do with me. This goes for, like I said, both issues that affect Muslims and those that do not. But ultimately, we're only able to do something and to try and make some change and encourage that good when we are unified, both in our spirit and our approach and our mindset and our vision, but also then in our action. That's when we can work towards advocating for oppressed groups around the world, whether that's Palestine or whether that's other causes. And this is, of course, a long-term project, and one that, the Ummatics Institute is one of several ventures where people are trying to, promote this transnational discourse between Muslim countries, and recognizing that the lines that divide us are not actually as deep as we have been led to believe. But as it's a project that is guided by our Islamic values, even if it is difficult, even if it may take a long time, it's one that needs to be actively pursued.
I love that that sentence when you said the lines that divide us is not as deep as we thought, and sort of that thing that you said. I think it's really it kind of breaks the illusion that we are separate. I mean, in reality, we are separated by, like you said, multiple identities of nationalities, ethnicities, other affiliations. And when we talk about ummah, the kind of transnational elements of the ummah, it should break those kind of imaginary lines that we thought are dividing us. And I think it goes back again to the Palestinian cause. Despite all the challenges, all the weakness of international laws, all the power, money, privilege, military equipment that the occupation force have, the idea and the spirit of ummah, a transnational ummah, it goes beyond everything, I think. And it, like you said, on the day of judgment, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the seed that we plant, the strife, the struggle that we collectively and individually given for justice, like you said, justice in a broader sense, and justice in the representing the Palestinian cause is something that really matters. And I think it's really like a spiritual value of this Ramadan is that rethinking ummah solidarity is something that is very important. And as a woman with all the multiple challenges and Muslim woman being silenced or as if we cannot speak for ourselves, like you said, like 8 workers from Western countries died by Israeli strike, and suddenly they are awake, the Western government. But tens of thousands of Palestinians, women died just like that, and they will say like, oh, it's just the war casualty. I remember Hillary Clinton was confronted by one of the audience in the event, and she said, well, this war, I mean, people die in war. And I'm like, how dare you said that?
But I think just to end on somewhat of a positive and hopeful note, what you've just mentioned there about the, now how after these aid workers have died, suddenly, that's what it took for European countries and Western countries to wake up. I think that actually shows the power of unity. Europe went from one of the most divided continents in the world, and a world war, 2 world wars that wrecked the entire globe, because of their own internal dynamics, just within the last century, to today, the global sort of power block that is determining the fate of the rest of the world. And now when their citizens or people from those countries are targeted in these conflicts, that's what provokes action. If anything, this should show us as Muslims that until we are unified in a similar way, and we have far fewer divisions compared to what Europe had when you're looking at World War I, the Europe of the 20th century, we have far fewer divisions as Muslim countries between us in terms of actual people. If they can achieve that level of unity, where now in a conflict that has killed so many, their lives are still so valued, and that prompts action finally from those Western governments, we can also strive for a unified civilization that will, inshallah, protect the rights of our people and the countries that we belong to and our fellow believers and all other people who face injustice. So if there's anything that we can take away from that hypocrisy, it's that this is something that we can, inshallah, strive for as well. And of course, it starts with conversations like this between us. So again, thank you so much, both Rizki and Riksa. It's been a really, really interesting conversation with you. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Sister Aisha, it's really wonderful to have you, and please come back again to Islam Bergerak if we have another opportunities to discuss with you on so many different topics. And so yes, so we are at the end of our discussion now. I am Rizki, and we have Rikza and Sutami. So we would like to again thank you so much for the discussion.
Thank you.